a short debrief of round 3 of WUDC, the round that we've just had. Just as an important two important disclaimers. One is, one important disclaimer is, obviously, I'm not going to be making a list of all the arguments that could be made in this round. That means if I have not made a specific argument that you yourself have made, that does not mean it's a bad argument. It just means I was focusing on other things. I think the range of arguments that could be made in debates is very large. The second thing is, if I make an argument that you have made in the debate, that does not necessarily mean that and you have taken a low place with that argument. That doesn't mean your judge was wrong. That doesn't mean I was wrong. It just means there is a lot to motions besides argument selection. There's strategy. There's the way you analyze the argument, and so on and so forth. So just to get that out of the way. So let's discuss the motion that we've had, a motion about whether environmental movements should focus on global issues such as global warming and so on, or whether they should focus, as the Gov case, on local issues such as local pollution, rivers, things of that sort. So I think obviously an important question in this debate is the question of what's called buy-in, meaning on what side or under which scenario are more people and which people are likely to be more supportive of the goals of the environmental movement. And basically the idea goes, the more people you have supporting you, the more political influence you have, the more ability you have to pressure corporations in order to do certain policies, the more ability you have to boycott organizations that are behaving in a problematic way environmentally, and so on and so forth. So from government, obviously the most likely analysis is saying when we focus on things that are local and are localized, people are more able to understand these things and therefore more able to take them into account. And they are more, first of all, just immediate to them. When something is immediate to you, when it influences your daily life or influences the daily lives of your neighbors, of people around you, people you care about, you're more likely to want to engage in that, and you're more likely to want to take action. Also, there is the point of patriotism. The notion of, for example, it's a very strong motivator for people when you tell them your country is under threat because of like the nature of your country, the air of your country, and local industries in your country might be under threat because of this local issue that's currently happening. There's also a point of, for example, the ability to know which actors are the ones creating the problem. So for example, if it's a local government, then it's significantly more easier to influence than it is to influence China or to influence the UN or other actors, meaning it seems to people to be a goal that's easier to pursue and therefore a more reachable goal and then government might say people become disparaged, people become discouraged when you tell them that something is unattainable or is really, really hard to fix. On the other side of that, if we are on op, we might want to say things like, first of all, it's the sort of changes you're able to do on a local, focusing on a local level are very small. Therefore, it's likely that people care about other things more than they care about doing these changes. So for example, if what you're able to do is clean up a beach in order to have, to allow turtles to lay their eggs safely and for this population to multiply, or you're cleaning a river for people to have a cleaner water source, it might be more important to people to focus on other pressing local concerns, which might be to them more important because politics is a very large, broad issue with different sets of obligations. On the other hand, when you tell people this is literally life-threatening to the entirety of humanity, that is something that's likely to create significant more of an impetus to change. It's also possible to claim, now these are like the meta versions of this. You could also claim from op, for example, that there is just enough of a buy-in to the environmental movement anyway. Like we have enough people, we have green parties being in parliament in most of Europe, we have multiple infrastructure, we have the EU doing major policies in order to advance environmentalism and so on, just as a way of mitigating the clash as a whole and focusing more on the impacts that are generated that are larger from global efforts than they are from local ones. Another thing you could possibly do from op or from gov is actually trying to be a bit more nuanced on what populations you're talking about. So for example, from gov, you could say, look, people who are already environmentally friendly are likely to remain that way on either side of the house. The problem is there are large parts of the population that we're unable to access because these people are usually associate environmentalism with global agendas. They associate it with liberalism. They associate it with many things that are problematic to them, meaning more conservative groups, right-wing groups, and so on. Through focusing our efforts on local needs and local communities, we're actually able to push against that. We're able to give them a narrative that they're actually willing to take in. So for example, if we tell them like globalism is actually destroying our country, you can actually get people who are traditionally Trump supporters to support the environmental movement, and that's a much more important goal, or that's a much more important group to get access to. On op, you might say, actually there are a lot of young people who care about, like, for whom the message of we're saving the world is much more important, or for example, and much more motivating, or people who have grown up with social networks and don't recognize to the same extent the importance of national boundaries. It might even seem petty and silly to them that we're prioritizing our own country over others and over much more pressing global concerns. So this, again, is something that can work both ways according to the way you characterize the populations we're trying to influence. Obviously, another clash is which policies are more important and more effective. Now, this is a clash that on the face of it seems to be quite weighed towards op, because obviously to us it seems intuitive that focusing on one of the world's most pressing global problems, such as, for example, global warming, is something that's more meaningful and more impactful than other things you can do. However, it's definitely possible to claim from gov that, for example, there is very little ability to actually create lasting change on that, given that many of the strongest polluting countries are not actually democracies that you're able to influence through popular support. So for example, even if you had somehow managed to achieve a huge environmental movement in China, that would not necessarily change the policies of the CCP. Or even if you have a lot of people in India or Bangladesh that are concerned about environmental issues, they're also concerned about having a regular flow of electricity everywhere in the country, and that might outweigh that consideration for most people, even if they think global warming is a thing that should be countered. And therefore, actually, when you're able to do concrete actions on the ground that don't necessarily require the same magnitude of change. So for example, it doesn't mean you have to cut down on power stations. It doesn't mean you have to stop major industry and development projects. It does mean, however, you, for example, get together with local factories, making sure that they divert pollution from one area to stop it from influencing certain villages or certain groups. That's a very tangible benefit to possibly thousands, tens of thousands of people that would not have been achieved otherwise, whereas on the other side, you're not able to achieve anything. Or on gov, you could also say on gov, there are sometimes specific solutions that seem small, but are actually very, very large. If we think about the COVID situation, then things like hygiene standards in factories and in animal farms and so on is something that can have a huge impact on relatively small, on a relatively small scale of initiative and action. If we were able to initially get rid of wet markets or make them more hygienic, then we would not have necessarily been in a situation in a year and a half of global pandemic. There are many things that can be done on a smaller scale. Obviously on op, you want to claim that all these things are marginal as opposed to the grand threat that is global warming on individuals' lives and so on. Obviously, there are clashes about the different ways in which this operates on different contexts in different countries. So for example, certain messages might be more appealing to people in developing countries as opposed to developed countries, or the needs might be different in what actually needs to be addressed. It might even be said that, for example, international institutions are putting too much of a burden. If we are if we're Gov, we might want to say that international arrangements and agreements are putting too much pressure on developing countries to cut down on pollutions when developed countries have already done their major stages of industrialization and therefore don't need it to the same extent. Therefore, it's very, very hard. It's a very hard sell, but also just an unfair thing to do to demand large developing countries that still need a significant industrialization, that have significant energy needs. It's unfair for us to even demand of them that they follow the same standards or that they limit their industries to the same extent. On the other hand, you might claim that developing countries are the ones that need the environmental movements within developing countries are very unlikely to be able to achieve results on their own if movements from developed countries are not actually there to help and to lobby and to, for example, supervise things like chains of production of multinational corporations, where they sell in the US, but then pollute in somewhere in Africa or in East Asia or other places. Then it's very hard for that local community or that local environmental organization in Africa or in Asia to actually oversee that on its own without the support of Western organizations, basically a fracturing of the environmental movement through this sort of policy. Finally, you also have questions of a political buy-in on a more global level. So, for example, where are people more likely to find common ground, and where are people more likely to influence things like the Paris Climate Accord, things like things like managing the response to climate change later on. So, for example, you might say from open, you might say that again, you need to focus on the most pressing, the largest problems. On Gov, on the other hand, you might say, for example, that when you gradually for example, you can't actually stop many of the impacts of global warming. We're already past that point, scientifically speaking, and therefore it's really important that countries establish as soon as possible arrangements on their own country that are able to tackle and mitigate and prevent many of the problems that are going to come. So, for example, solidifying shorelines or heightening construction in a way that will stop places from going underwater, getting better readiness for natural disasters of various kinds. And this is actually much more likely to be achieved on a localized level when you employ the narrative of security, of public safety, and not when you're talking about let's try and solve this huge problem that isn't unclear how it can actually be solved. So these are just general thoughts. Obviously, there are other things that can be done in this debate, but I think the clashes on buy-in, on effectiveness on global regimes and global relations and how they're influenced, all of these are things that can be very impactful and very important lines within this debate. I hope you found that useful and wish you great luck in the next rounds.
Great. Thanks, Ayal. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'll be doing the other debrief for the next 15 minutes of lunch to talk about the round 1 motion. So I'm really excited about these motions, including the one that Ayal just went through. I think that was a really good job. And I will be talking about the round 1 motion, which I'm even more excited about. The motion, for those who have forgotten or were not around for round 1, is this House, as South Korea, would aim to significantly increase its cross-border economic cooperation with North Korea. So a couple of caveats before I start. The first is that I was not around for a round. I didn't judge it, nor did I debate it. So obviously, I haven't seen the debate play out. I will talk about what I think the arguments are based on my own 15 minutes of prep before this call. But if you have if your debate played out in a different way, super welcome comments about it. Really welcome people sharing about what happened in your debate as well. I think lots of debates can be very different, and there's lots that we can learn from each other. The second is very similar to what Ayal said at the start of his session, which is really that it's not an exhaustive list of arguments. This is going to be a 15-minute chat about the motion. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about in the motion if it can be a debate that lasts for more than an hour. So this is not going to be all of it. And argument selection isn't the end all and be all of what a good debate is or what good speech is. So if you did pick these arguments, that doesn't mean that necessarily you have a debate winning case. Don't go and complain to your judges afterwards. And if you didn't pick these arguments, that doesn't mean that you therefore are not going to do well or didn't do well. Like, it entirely depends on what you run and how you run it and what other teams in the room run. So I'll get started. So I guess, like, looking at this motion, the first things I kind of want to talk about is what does this economic cooperation look like, and you know, what are some examples of this? I really was drawn to the phrase cross-border when it comes to cross-border economic cooperation. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in terms of cross-border, and it's especially interesting because the border is so contested between South and North Korea. The first thing that comes to mind is really the Kaesong industrial region. Some of you who were around in Ayuna circuit when I was seeing a bit there would remember that I said a motion about that recently. So I'm really excited to talk about it. Sorry, not recently, like a while back, but I'm really excited to talk about it. And so if you're not, if you haven't heard of it, you can go and Google it. It's the Kaesong industrial region, or there are a few different names for it, but like Kaesong usually gets the results, Kaesong. And really, it's kind of like a cross-border initiative taking place within like quite near to like the demilitarized area, where South Korean companies use North Korean kind of workers in order to gain access to cheap sources of labor, and also to kind of employ North Koreans on quite a small scale and be able to kind of remunerate them for their labor and create a certain degree of economic model that is not found in some other parts of North Korea. So that's the immediate one that comes to mind when I talk about this. And that's really the kind of the big example that I have in my head when I'm thinking about this case. But I think beyond that, it's worth mentioning there are lots of different other kinds of cross-border economic cooperation. This generally refers to like trade. So it could be like import-export activities, for example, like, you know, like South Korea could manufacture like machinery and stuff that can go into North Korea. They can be exported to North Korea. They can import stuff from North Korea that would be like food, like agrarian stuff, like lots of different kind of products. They can kind of fuel the North Korean industry and economy in quite a big way. So there's obviously a lot going on here. I think a good team would probably want to be specific about the kinds of economic cooperation you have in mind, and this is entirely up to the Gov. And if the Gov doesn't come up with these examples, I think it's entirely fair for the op to like kind of challenge that and like just press for a few of these examples, because I do think examples make the points a little bit easier to impact, which I will go into. So first I want to talk about the econ stuff, and I'll try to kind of cover the Gov and op arguments both, and then maybe some stuff about like kind of the strategic bilateral relationship between them, whether we're talking about some kind of reunification or political change kind of arguments, and finally, if we have time, some stuff about security and like more geostrategic, broadly peace kind of arguments. So let's first chat about like econ arguments. Not fun for lots of people, but I do think that in this particular case, it's quite interesting because North Korea actually has, you know, for many different reasons that you can elaborate in your speeches, North Korea has like, is a really, really good source of like cheap labor for some South Korean companies, and traditionally South Korean companies have tapped on that within the cross-border context in order to create some kind of comparative advantage for them. And that's really important for a lot of these, I think, South Korean companies, especially in specific key sectors, right? So I think it's useful to go into some of these key sectors in terms of like textiles, or in terms of like kind of labor-intensive industries, where like the labor cost and being able to cut down on the labor cost will be a really, really huge, important part of cutting down the overall cost of production, and therefore increasing the kind of profits you get from South Korea. I think if you want to run this argument on Gov, what you really need to talk about is why this is so important to South Korea. This is an active debate, obviously, and you have to talk about South Koreans' interests. And I think that you need to do a lot of work in terms of why econ is like perhaps more important if you're making this argument than some of the other stuff that we're talking about in the session later on, for example, like the reunification and peace stuff, but also B, why the economic benefits that accrue from this are going to go to the correct actors, i.e. like if they go to like say like the big companies, the chaebols, why that is either a good thing or like how the average South Korean person is going to be able to benefit off that. And you know, alternatively beyond op, I would really recommend kind of poking holes at that argument and explaining why you don't think that like maybe a really successful South Korean companies being slightly more successful and slightly more profitable is a worthy trade-off against all of the like costs that you're going to argue on op. So what are these economic costs that you're going to argue on op? The biggest one I really think of Well, okay. Firstly, I think in the short term, I think that it creates like a perverse incentive that kind of outprices the labor market within South Korea. So it's quite hard, for example, for you to hire a South Korean factory worker if you have access to North Korean factory workers, and so that kind of displaces jobs from South to North Korea. But I think also secondly, in terms of like the longer term stuff, I think the companies then end up never like evolving and innovating some degree of like technological expertise or some degree of like innovation that really cuts down on the labor cost. So this could be, for example, in terms of automation, but also like not just automation. I think that that's low hanging fruit. I really think there's a lot more to say about how like the company practices, how they like manufacture things, the kind of how complicated the things are, or like how much labor is needed in order to like produce like X amount of product. Could be better over time, and there's never that incentive if it's always going to be consistently cheap labor coming from North Korea. And finally, the last economic argument that comes to mind for op is really about the longer economic direction. I think that there is a trade-off that you can try to push on op in terms of why it's mutually exclusive to kind of rely so much on North Korean labor versus being able to, for example, engage with like the wider like world and like being a bit closer to the West and being like a preferred partner for the US. Context of this is, the US is like reshoring or what they call friendshoring, so that their supply chains kind of get located in places that are a bit more friendly to them in terms of to like allies and partners, and in terms of like economies that they feel like they have some degree of trust and security and resilience in the wake of the supply chain disruptions that happened in COVID-19. And I think that my sense is like South Korea really would want to tap on that. If they haven't really been doing so, I think they have, but if they haven't been doing so, they will want to tap on that because South Korea has traditionally been such a huge American ally, and also very much wants to try and break into the American market for consumer demand. Why is this mutually exclusive? Because America also, in the new administration under the Biden administration, has a lot of issues in terms of forced labor and like human rights, and like it just seems like the kind of thing where they would be like less willing to trade with South Korean companies or prefer South Korean companies, give them preferential treatment, no tariffs, etc., lower the tariff barriers, if they were relying on North Korean forced labor in order to manufacture their products, right? So that's like a huge risk that South Korean companies therefore have to take on in exchange for having really cheap labor. And I think that's a really powerful opposition point because it really caps the amount of economic growth that you can get from that government point. And so depending on how you argue it, I think that there is quite a good debate here about what the average South Korean company would want to do, and therefore what is in the larger interest of South Korea as a country. So we've talked about workers, we've talked about companies, we've talked about econ more broadly. Let's talk a little bit as well about like the politics side of things, right? So I think the gov argument here that comes to mind is really in terms of like trying to temper the aggressiveness of the North Korean government by kind of finding mutual areas of like cooperation and having some degree of like mutual interest, like vested interest, so that the government kind of is placated to some extent and is able to receive some of those like benefits from this corporation. I think that there needs to be a lot of logical links to be able to prove that on Gov. Firstly, I think you need to prove why economic cooperation would be something that benefits the elite in North Korea. I think like if you want to argue anything about North Korean kind of politics and decision making, you really have to show why this best interest of the elites. And there's very much an elite in terms of the political elite as well as like the so-called economic elite who are like one tier lower, I would say. So like not in the center, like inner circle of making political decisions, but the people that like, for example, have monopolies on like the sale or the production of very basic necessities like toothpaste and toothbrush, or like like toilet paper, like very 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 like basic things that still is necessary for like quite a big portion of the people. Those people still have like some kind of incentive, right? And if they're getting beaten out by like South Korean goods, they might not be very happy. So that's the upside of the argument about how this kind of displaces the kind of balance of power internally within North Korea. And so this might not necessarily be taken well by North Korea as a policy. At this point, I want to note that the motion says this house would aim to significantly increase. It doesn't say that you will significantly increase. So the amount of prop fiat is not a huge amount in this debate. And you really have to on prop show why you're going to be able to benefit the elite in order for this argument to go well. But secondly, I think that you also have to show why this is therefore going to be like outweighing a lot of the other political reasons why, for example, the government in the DPRK would be very aggressive. So for example, like prospects of changes in leadership with like Kim Jong-un's like sister potentially becoming like up to power and, you know, really resuming a much greater role in the leadership, there's an even greater incentive for her to like want to be a strong man. And so how does this economic bunch of reasons, or these reasons related to economic cooperation, outweigh all of those other reasons to, for example, have power projection, to be able to, for example, all the other political influences, there might be political infighting, factionalism, all that stuff. So I think that this is quite a hard point to make on Gov, I would say. I think the op is much more powerful here in terms of how it will have very little effect. However, on op is also insufficient to just say that this has like minimal effect. That's just mitigating, right? So you want to show how this is going to be counterproductive. And how is this actually counterproductive? I think that op then has to prove the burden about how this will actually, like how you try to significantly increase your economic cooperation and you fail to do so because of like North Korea not being like particularly facilitative, how that's going to hurt South Korea's interest. And secondly, in terms of how this introduces more vulnerability. So there might be a scenario where, for example, you do initially succeed at having greater cross-border economic cooperation, but then ultimately it just causes like South Korea to be, for example, reliant on North Korea. And then North Korea now has leverage to use and can use that as a kind of bargaining chip when they're playing that cross-border political fight with South Korea. So a good example of this, for example, is that there's instance, I think, where the Kaesong industrial region got shut down and North Korea just unilaterally decided that like in the middle of the day, they're gonna like get all the laborers to go home, and they just close down the region and they like bar like South Korea from being able to access what's going on in that side because it's on the North Korea kind of side of the border control. And there were a lot of company like assets that were lost, like companies that invested in factories, that invested in workshops there and invested in machinery there. It's very difficult for them to claim it back, right? So that's kind of like economic vulnerabilities and security vulnerabilities that happen if you are go on with this policy and then North Korea decides to use it without the best of intentions. And so I think on OPU, there's a lot of like prospect for you to be able to prove that. And I think if you're able to prove that, that's quite strong. And then the debate becomes about those economic versus strategic kind of considerations. So at the meta level, why one priority is better, more important than the other priority, or why one vulnerability is going to be so like existential that it outweighs any potential benefit that you get. And that's where I think in the actor debate, you have a lot of this discussion about actor interest and about what the people want. So in terms of economic growth, whether they want good wages, whether they want good products, I forgot to add that also if the one benefit also in South Korea is that you get access to North Korean products. And then there's a characterization debate about whether those North Korean products are useful to the average South Korean, whether it will bring prices down as a consumer, and whether this, for example, will free up more job opportunities. So you don't need more like South Koreans to do jobs that are, for example, low wage, low skill, not stuff that people want to do. And you're able to now afford to like upskill those workers into higher technology, higher skill kind of jobs, because so much of it is being done by the lower skill kind of oppressed workforce that's happening in North Korea. And on the other hand, in terms of security and vulnerabilities, the reliability of supply chains is a big deal after COVID-19. And also in terms of larger like political reunification, whether you get like a more stable or less stable situation. Last thing I would say in terms of like the last point more broadly towards peace, I would say that that's quite a big point, and I quite like this point as a debater about how what people want the most is just like nothing to happen at all on the cross-border front so that they can live their lives in peace. And this is like from the perspective of South Korea. Like you have good lives when stuff happens on the border in North Korea, those lives get interrupted. You live under like this, like you might live under this like fear that something's going to escalate. There's a bit of tension going on when you're not sure. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially when it comes to the security situation. And I would think that my favorite argument for this is that having economic cooperation is a good barometer for cross-border relations. There are times when North Korea just wants to project power. So you flip this argument on Gov. You want to project power. Currently, you project power through border skirmishes, fighting, launching a rocket. Now you can project power by closing down a factory. Like, that's not great, but it's still much better than having a rocket fly over your peninsula. And so those might be like a way to de-escalate that kind of border conflict. And therefore, even though like they're still going to like try to send a message, that message is said in a way that's less disruptive to your lives and is less concerning for your sense of security and your ability to live life as the right to live life without like fear hanging over your heads. And so I would say that that's how I think on Gov I would try to win that argument, even though I do think slightly stronger than all. We're out of time, but and I also can't see any questions, I realize, because I'm not looking at the Facebook page, I'm looking at the Zoom page that you're live streaming from. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask me or any of your judges. I'm sure that Ayal is fantastic. If you need to reach out to me, you can talk to me on Facebook. I don't really read my Discord, sorry about that. But yeah, best of luck for the rest of the rounds today and for the rest of the competition. Thanks for listening.